Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 25-ton Champion log splitter. This machine was dropped off by my buddy Jason, who actually scored the mother load. He was randomly contacted by someone to haul away scrap, and this was one of those items. And actually, I'll put up a video of the other items that he brought home in his trailer, but he essentially scored a more or less brand new snowblower, a very unused lawnmower, and a nice John Deere tractor, and of course, this log splitter as well. So those other pieces of equipment he already got up and running. He said pretty much every one of them had a substantial amount of water in the tank. So after getting the fuel systems cleaned out, those machines ran without issue. But this one, it's not going to be an easy fix, which is why he dropped it off to us. That said, though, just looking at the machine, it looks to be in fantastic shape. There does not appear to be any damage. There is virtually no rust. And if you look at it real close, it doesn't even look like this machine has been used. There is no scratching to speak of. And if you look here at this cutting edge or the splitting edge, it is perfect aside from a bit of rust. So there is a possibility that this machine has never been used and potentially just sat outside too long, causing its problems. So, I haven't gone through it thoroughly, but the two problems I have identified are the engine and the hydraulic valve. The engine does not rotate forward or backwards, so the engine is likely stuck, or potentially the hydraulic pump is stuck. And even if we get these issues sorted out, we do have issues over here with this control valve. The lever seems to be stuck, likely rusted in place. So yeah, we've got some issues to work through, but the goal for this video will be to get this up and running again. So let me set up a little bit better and get going on this. All right, so first things first, let's check the oil. And it is worth noting there is a low oil sensor which has not been bypassed, so it would seem unlikely that the engine ran out of oil. And there is oil, but that color looks a little bit off, like there might be some water contamination in there. Yeah, it's kind of a milk chocolate color. I think I can almost see water droplets in there. So that is not a good sign. I would say the engine is stuck, either because the bottom end rusted up or potentially rust in the cylinder. Either way, though, I don't like the way this oil looks. So I'm going to pull the drain plug and get that out. And I'm going to hold off putting any oil in there until we get the engine to rotate. Yeah, that is mostly water coming out there. And now transitioning to an oil-water mix. Yeah, this engine might be done. So once this is done draining, I would say the next move is to get the spark plug out. Potentially the top end doesn't have water in it, but given the engine doesn't rotate, I'm gonna guess that we might see a bit of rust. So before I pull the spark plug, I'm actually going to get the airbox cover off and probably the filter. That'll just give us a little bit better view of the spark plug. And I'm noticing we might be missing something here too. So rain could have gotten in to the airbox. And of course, that's going to funnel right down into the carburetor. So if that happens, the top end might be pretty much shot. So this is just a vent for the tank. The line's kind of petrified. So to get the airbox off, we need to pull this first. All right, so we have a filter, but yeah, this right here, I think was supposed to be there. And without that, that was a path for the water to get in, and it's a straight shot down to the carb and into the intake. And that's what I'm talking about right there. So that's where the hole was. Rainwater would have come in and gone straight down into the carburetor. And of course, the next step is into the engine. So you can see there was definitely water and some rust. So yeah, that is not a good sign. I think when we pull that plug out, we're likely going to see a bunch of rust on that tip. Yeah, it doesn't feel very good. At this point, it's been cracked free, but I don't think it's going to turn without the wrench. So yeah, likely we're going to see some rust on this plug. Yeah, that's not good. And that is what the plug looks like. So definitely water for sure got into the cylinder. And I think this has a steel sleeve. So likely the entire cylinder looks like that. So let's get the borescope out and see what it looks like. All right, let's have a look with the borescope with the downward facing camera and see what we see. Not holding my breath though on this one. I think we're going to see rust, and yeah, I actually can't see a whole lot. The piston is more or less at the top of its travel, so that might be a good thing. Potentially the entire cylinder isn't destroyed. So I'm going to switch to the side camera, and let's go back in, see if we can see the sidewall of the cylinder. And I see a valve that's open. And yeah, if you look beyond the valve, kind of on the left of your screen there, you can see the cylinder. And I mean, the piston isn't completely at the top, but it is probably about 95% of the way there. But there is a lot of rust from what I can see. So yeah, this engine, I think it is shot, but I'm going to try to free it up because removing that hydraulic pump, likely there's some set screws and potentially we might have to rotate the engine to access them. So let's get a little bit of penetrating oil down there, maybe a little bit of Marvel mystery oil, and we'll try to turn the crank. At this point, don't think we have anything to lose. No, that's pretty stuck. Let's try something with a little more leverage. Turning the nut. Let's try it backwards. And now I'm just loosening the nut. So it's not just a little stuck, it's stuck. So it's not looking good for this engine, given the evidence we have so far, the water in the oil, the rust on the plug, and the rust in the cylinder. So, even applying excessive force and some penetrating oil didn't get this crankshaft to budge. So, if we gave it time, potentially we could get it to rotate again, but the damage, it is already done. And I do have a couple engines that might replace this one with very little modification. So we won't know that for sure, really, until we get a look at the crankshaft and compare that to the other engines I have. So let's shift gears. Let's get the hydraulic pump off, make sure that rotates, and then we'll get the engine off of the machine. So to get the pump off, we have 2 bolts right here and also 2 on the bottom. So I think if we remove those, the pump will be free from the engine, and then we can remove the engine mounting bolts and get the engine off the frame. It's actually on there pretty loose. I'm spinning the nut on the backside, but the fact that it's not rusted in place is a good sign. And I'm probably going to leave these top ones on loosely. We'll get the bottom ones off all the way, and then we'll pull the pump away, and I might need to suspend it. I'm not sure if I can drop it all the way down, but I might. I guess we'll find out. Okay, we're loose. I guess the unknown here is that, can we pull the pump away from this housing? Because there is a cover on the bottom, so potentially it's slotted and we have to drop it out that way. Okay, good. So the pump came off without issue, and I've been able to leave the lines attached. It's just sitting right there in the filter for the hydraulic system, kind of strapped out of the way. And the really good news is that the pump rotates just fine. So if we get a engine that actually works, likely the pump is going to build pressure. So easy enough to get this off. And really the only thing we're going to need from this engine is this piece right here, and then the part on the crankshaft that meshes with the pump. So let's get actually this bottom cover off first. We have 2 screws on each side. Then we'll pull these 4 bolts, and this should come out, and then we'll be left with the collar on the crankshaft. So I am a little surprised actually that there is no bolt somehow securing this in. So there must be a set screw. Maybe. And no, actually no set screw either. So maybe it's just the whole sandwich that holds this tight. And by tight, it's probably very tight given the rust in here. So I guess we could try a puller and hope for the best. All right, so we'll just try a 3-jaw puller. There's a little lip right here, so I'm hoping that we can get it to hold on. And if it's not rusted on, it shouldn't take a whole lot of force. Yeah, actually I'm just twisting this by hand, and thankfully it's moving. It's coming off. But it is getting tight, so yeah, maybe we'll get a wrench on it and get it off the rest of the way. All right, so let's see what we're dealing with as far as the crankshaft goes. So the diameter, it is 3/4 of an inch, and the length is measured from the end to the metal on the crankcase cover. So, you know, this measurement's going to be a little bit less exact because we're going at a slight angle, but that comes in at 2.48. So that's actually good news because a Predator 212 also has a 3/4 inch shaft, and the length on the Predator is advertised as 2.43. So worst case, you know, a Predator 212 would be a perfect replacement for this engine. So with the engine out of the way, that kind of brings us to the next problem. And it's surprising actually that we have rust there, because the rest of the machine is virtually rust free, and rust pretty much anywhere on this wouldn't cause an issue except right there. So like that, you know, this doesn't move. Potentially we could free it up with force, but my concern is for the seals in here. You know, if we drive this rust in, we could tear those seals up. So I'm going to use the little wire wheel on the Dremel, clean up what I can, and then we'll try to get this lever to move. Actually, change of plan. So the Dremel was not going to work too well because we can't get access to the bottom. But some sandpaper, we can theoretically get that in there. The space is tight. but we can feed it through. So we'll do that with a bit of WD-40, and that should take care of the rust. So anyway, I think you get the idea. I'm going to have to do this a little bit more. Seems to be a shoulder right here. So really the only part we need to clean is just this little bit. And you can see it is starting to shine up. All right, so we've got that shoulder cleaned up, and I'm hoping that the valve's in the neutral position. So, that way we can drive it out, clean up some more of that rust before trying to push it in. So let's try pulling it first. And no, it is not moving. So let's try a few taps. It might have moved a little bit. There we go. It's moving now. But not by hand, so let's tap it all the way out. Which is right there. And we'll do the same process, just clean up that piston or cylinder, and then we'll work it back and forth, and hopefully this frees up. Yeah, we're just about there. So I'm going to give this a little bit more, I think, in this area. And then we'll try to actuate it back and forth. Okay, so I'm just going to put a little bit of WD-40 on there to help the seals out. And that works perfectly. So that is split. Although it doesn't go in too well. There we go. Fixed. So at this point, I think all we need to do is drop a good engine in this one's place. So the one I have in mind, you guys have actually seen before. some time ago. Actually, Jason dropped off a Kohler branded Honda clone that I did a video on, and that one wasn't in that bad a shape, and we fixed it all up. So it is more or less ready to go, and I believe it's a direct replacement for this one right here. So let's make a trip to the storage locker. We'll measure it up, and if everything checks out, we'll bring it back and get it bolted on. And there's our prize. So let's get it out and get that crankshaft measured up. So we do have a lot of buildup on the crankshaft that we're going to have to clean off. But visually, it looks to be the right size. So yeah, diameter 0.75 inches, so that is good. And let's check the length. We're hoping for 243. Although at this angle, it's going to be a little bit more. Yeah, 245. So this engine should work. All right, so we made it back to the house. And we do need to clean up this shaft, but even before then, we need to get the rusty key out of the way. So we'll tap that out of place, and then we're going to use sandpaper like we did up on the hydraulic valve to clean up the shaft. And of course, the key isn't going to play nice. And I guess technically we don't have to pull this key out, but it is going to make cleaning the crankshaft a lot easier. There we go. A little bit more. Okay. So crankshaft is clean. So I'm just going to dry this a little bit better. I'm going to use some anti-seize to help the next guy out. And then we'll get this collar installed, and the engine should be good to go. So the thread should be the same. So we're going to use the original bolts, or at least try to. I don't have the exact torque specs on this. Actually, I don't have torque specs at all, but I'm going to bring it up to about 180 inch-pounds. You know, maybe a touch more, depending upon how it feels. So we'll get all 4 of these engine bolts loosely in place, and once they're all there, we can snug them down. So we've got all 4 bolts secured, and the engine is good to go. So let's get the pump reattached and go for the first start. So it's a little bit hard to access this area. It's right kind of central to the machine. So we get the bottom bolts in first. They were actually in the opposite way. So the nuts go on this side, whereas the top ones, the nuts go on the back side. So yeah, let's try to get the pump back where it belongs. And we save the hardest one for last. And actually, I might reverse this if I can. And no, I can't. The reason why I don't like going in this way is because if I drop a washer or the nut, it's going into this housing, but I guess probably won't matter too much. I didn't put the bottom cover on, so it should fall out the bottom. And I can almost guarantee you it's going to fall out the bottom in a second. Nope. Got the nut started. And surprisingly, according to this sticker right here, this machine was manufactured September of 2017, so just over 8 years old. Definitely too young for an engine replacement, but here we are. So we have a used engine, but one that works, and hopefully everything else works. So let's add some fuel to the tank, we'll pull the cord, and see what we get. Yeah, it looks like we might be a little bit low on hydraulic fluid, so I'm going to pull the cap. I just want to make sure we're not super low. You know, we're not empty. The return line here, it is clear, and you can see there is hydraulic fluid going to the pump, but you don't want to have this reservoir too low. This is actually how it cools, and if you're down on fluid, then it's going to heat up pretty fast and eventually cause damage to that pump. There we go. Well, it's not empty, but it does look to be pretty low. So let's try to get a better read at where that's at. All right, so right there, we're touching the bottom. And yeah, we're pretty low. We only have about 1.5 inches of fluid in there. So yeah, that makes me wonder where all the fluid went. And of course, I don't have any hydraulic fluid to add to it right now. So, you know, that theoretically will be enough to at least do a quick test, but we're definitely going to have to top this off before putting it to work. All right, let's give this a try. Ignition's on. We'll give it a bit of throttle. Choke and fuel are both on. All right, let's try it again. Huh. All right, so we might have some carb issues here. So we'll try it with partial choke. Huh. So we do have a lot of air in the line right here, and it actually looks like what hydraulic fluid we have has already turned milky. So yeah, let's just maybe pull the hose off. We need to drain the system out and refill it to the proper amount with good fluid. Oh yeah, we've got milkshake, unfortunately. So I can't say I'm that surprised, given the water that was in this engine and what Jason said about the other equipment. Clearly water was a big issue here. So we'll get out as much as we can. And I'm not sure if we should refill this completely with hydraulic fluid. You know, we can't get all the water out of the system. So we might have to flush it a couple times. But it's not terrible, actually. You know, as far as milkshakes go, you know, a lot of this is just froth. And the oil that's coming out, there is some water in there, but it's not a lot. So I think I'm just going to leave this to drain. I definitely need to make a trip to Tractor Supply to pick up some more hydraulic fluid.
We don't need it. Because you guys don't help. Maybe because you support me, that's for sure.
All right, so we made it back from Tractor Supply with 10 gallons of hydraulic fluid, as well as a new oil filter. Now, the capacity on this is only 4.5 gallons, so hopefully we don't need all that fluid to flush the system out. It is not cheap. Anyway, before leaving, I did use the scissor jack just to lift this side up to help get out as much as we can. And now that it's been sitting a while, it doesn't look quite as bad as it initially did. So I'm hoping we're not going to need all 10 gallons to get this system to clean up. So before just adding 4.5 gallons, I think we are going to have to test this and just make sure we don't have any leaks. We don't even know for sure that the pump works. So we'll put about 2 gallons in. And actually, before we do that, I might crack this filter loose. I'm not going to replace it yet, but we'll just get some of the contaminated fluid out of there and move this scissor jack over to this side. We'll lift the unit up. So whatever oil is left in there will go over towards the fill. We'll use the fluid extractor, get out every bit that we can, and then we'll put a couple gallons in, get the system started, see if things work. We'll do a flush and then fill it to capacity. Okay, it's already empty, so we didn't actually need to do that. So I'm gonna get this hose reconnected. We get some fluid in the system and try this again. Yeah, it's a lot better. We got about twice as much as we did the last time we tried, so hopefully that's enough. So let's get the engine started again. We're going to have to cycle the hydraulics to kind of purge the air out. And assuming everything goes well, we'll shut it down, check the condition of the oil, and make a decision, if we need to flush it again. All right, let's give this a try. Choke's on, ignition's on. And hopefully the engine runs a little better this time. So that was a much better result. This time the engine started right up, could turn the choke off right away, and the engine ran absolutely perfect. So the engine, I think, is good to go, and the hydraulic system's looking pretty good as well. We don't have any leaks, and the valve seemed to work just fine. I had no issues deploying and retracting the ram, so all that seems good. Really, the only thing worth noting here is that when you retract, there is a detent that holds it in that position, and when it gets to the end of its travel, it's supposed to pop out into neutral, which that didn't seem to be happening. So potentially we need to make an adjustment. Maybe just using it might free up whatever the issue is. And we also likely have air in the system, so potentially that is causing an issue as well. Either way, though, that is a pretty minor issue, and this machine is definitely usable like it is. So yeah, I think we need to get the oil flushed out. It actually looks pretty good. Actually looks very good. So I may have misread the oil. And now that this has been sitting for an hour, it looks really good. So potentially that may have been air bubbles in there and not actually water. So, I'm tempted to leave the oil in there, but I don't think we can change the filter with the oil in there due to its location. As soon as I pull that out, we're going to lose the contents of the tank. So yeah, I think we have no choice, and it's probably better to be safe than sorry. So let's drain the system, get the oil filter changed. We'll fill it up to capacity, and then I think we'll be good to go. So I'm fairly certain that the amount of oil in this tank is probably more than this bin can handle. So we're going to have to keep an eye on that. And I might use the fluid extractor as well to maybe offset some of that. Yeah, that oil looks great. All right, I think they were empty enough. So we're going to use this K&N filter. Tried to find a Wix, but kind of came up empty. Anyway, this one is recommended in the manual. And shockingly, I went to Advanced Auto to pick this up. Normal price for this, $25. This one, $1.75. I guess they're trying to get rid of the line, and they're practically giving these filters away. So made out pretty well on this one. And we are pretty much full, actually maybe a touch over full, but we're in the ballpark and certainly better than how it was before. So I think we're good, at least as far as the hydraulic oil goes. And next I was actually going to tear down, the stuck engine as much as I could. But this problem with the auto return is kind of bothering me. Not to mention, when I move this spool, it's not springing back very well anymore like it did when we first freed it up. And I actually hear lots of scratching noises down here, which is also the adjustment for the auto return. So, I think we do need to take a look at this and see if we can't figure out what's going on with this valve. So this right here, it is just a plastic cap, and there is an adjustment there which controls, when this lever springs back. And there's actually a bunch of corrosion on that. So that's probably the scraping that I'm hearing. And likely that's why this auto return isn't working either. So let's clean this up a bit. But I'm thinking making a simple adjustment here is likely not going to fix it. We might actually have to take this apart. But let's start by doing the easy thing and see what that gets us. Yeah, it just doesn't sound good. I definitely hear scraping or, noises that I don't think are normal. So likely there is more rust and corrosion deeper in. So I think what we need to do here is loosen this lock nut. Actually, just take it all the way off. Then we have two bolts right here that should allow this housing to slide off. And then we can get a better look at kind of what the issue is inside. And of course the bolt isn't going to turn. And I'm actually stripping out the center. Yeah, that's not good. So I'll be the first to admit this is probably not a good idea. This nut is stuck, and I'm thinking the impact might be the best thing to try to get this off. We could apply heat, but I'm guessing there are seals in here that likely will be destroyed. And, I do want to get this working properly. So either we're going to buy a new valve that isn't damaged, or we're going to fix this one. So let's try. Nope, gotta tighten those vice grips. There we go. Yeah, that's a mess in there. So these sleeves right here, I think they're supposed to slide, and they're kind of covered in rust. And just looking underneath this one, it looks like there's a lot of junk under there. So let's see if we can get those off and get them cleaned up. Yeah, it's just a lot of pitting on here, so this may never work right again. So those balls right there, those are the detents that are supposed to release when the ram has fully retracted. And well, that one does move a little bit. And so does that one. So yeah, there's a chance. So we've got a spring, and I believe there's a check ball in there. Maybe. So that part there, I think it's just a spacer, but this piece here actually has a race that locks into those balls right there. So I'm thinking if we clean this out and maybe sand to this a bit, I want to be careful not to damage the balls any more than they already are. But this surface is pretty rough, even after wire wheeling it. So that needs to be smoothed out some more. And then we can try this again. You know what? The spring is broken right there. So, yeah, I'm not sure about this one. You know, it kind of looks like a valve spring. I guess we could put a valve spring on there, but I'm not sure if that's going to do what we want it to do. And that probably explains why initially when we freed this up, you know, it felt like the return was really good, and then the return wasn't so good after a little while. So the spring actually split in two. So to get that off, it looks like this is keyed. So if I can find a really large flathead screwdriver, we can probably twist this whole assembly right out, freeing up that spring. And I don't have a screwdriver that big, so we're going to have to use the vice grips. Which I'm not crazy about. Yeah, I don't know. It's tightening up. So I'm afraid this piece here is going to get damaged, and then we're pretty much looking at either buying parts or just get a new valve. But it's still turning. All right, starting to loosen up a bit. So it's possible this was actually working. And with that broken spring, there just was nothing to kind of push it back once these check balls released. Or maybe not nothing, but less pressure than there should have been. Looks like a check ball just fell out. Probably one of these. Yeah, that one right there. All right, so for better or worse, we've got it off the machine. And I think I was wrong. There is no check valve, at least on this end. But I believe there may be, yeah, on the other end. So we do have a check ball that this spring pushes up against. And that's the adjustment right there. So you drive this further in, and that's going to push that check ball harder, which means you have to build more pressure before that kicks back into neutral. So that is the adjustment right there. And, you know, we do have multiple issues going on here, the corrosion being probably the biggest. And, of course, the broken spring not helping things at all. So, yeah, let's get that off. We have a little bit of thread sealant right there, so hydraulic pressure must feed down the center. And I don't think there's a whole lot more going on in here. But we did lose a check ball, so I guess the question is, how do we get that back in? And actually, do we want to get it back in yet? Because if we can remove these, you know, that'll give us a little bit more freedom to clean this or sand it smooth. So let's take a closer look in there and see how this one escaped and why the other ones are still held in place. So there's something down there that actually is where the check ball kind of sits. And the little check balls are around that central ball. So yeah, normally the spring pressure, I guess, is holding that large check ball in place, which in turn holds these ones in place. And there's a detent right in here, which locks that valve in the retract position. So once the ram comes all the way back, then there must be some hydraulic pressure that builds and pushes through. It pushes that check ball up. And at that point, these are allowed to move in, and the broken spring pushes the lever back into neutral. So that still doesn't answer the question, how did this one escape? And how do we get this apart? It kind of looks like it's one piece, but it's hard to tell with all the rust and corrosion. Yeah, potentially that pedestal for that larger check ball comes out of there. Okay, lost another ball. Okay, I think that answers that question. Kind of. The balls are actually coming out from the outside. So I'm not convinced that this is going to work, even if I get all these balls out and get everything cleaned up. Okay. So let's scrounge around and see if we can find out what we can replace this with. Well, potentially a valve spring from this stuck engine might be the size we need. Maybe not. It looks a little small, diameter-wise. And normally you would not want to do this because it's going to drop a valve into the cylinder. But in this case, we're pulling the head soon enough. Maybe. And no, I don't think that spring's going to work. It's much lighter, and the diameter is a little bit too small to fit on there. So we're going to have to keep looking for something closer to the original. So we kind of struck out with this spring, and I'm not convinced that if we got a new spring that we'd be back in business. I did check the Champion website for a parts breakout on this valve, and they don't have one. It's basically, if there's a problem, you buy a new valve, you don't fix the broken one. So yeah, with that in mind, I could likely find a spring that would work. The issue is we are dealing with a lot of corrosion, And more importantly, the hydraulic pressure comes in right here. And I think that is supposed to actuate that pedestal that this large ball bearing sits on. And that is critical because when that pedestal pushes against the spring, these balls are allowed to go in, and that releases the hold that it has on the detent, returning this back to the neutral position. And that pedestal, it is stuck solid. It does not move. I've tried to free it up, and potentially, we could apply some heat and maybe break that free, but I'm not so sure that's a good idea because the hydraulic system, it is sealed. There's likely seals in here that are going to be damaged with excessive heat. And at the end of the day, we're left with a bunch of corroded components. And likely, even if we get it to work, it's not going to work for very long. So yeah, we have pretty much nothing financially invested in this log splitter other than the hydraulic fluid. So I think the right thing to do here is just to order a new valve. All right, so the valve has been ordered, and unfortunately not the OEM one. I'm not sure why I'm always surprised when I go to order OEM parts and they're not available. This machine being a brand name and only 8 years old, I thought we'd be able to get the correct part, but that was not the case. So I ordered an aftermarket part, not quite the same, but I think it'll get us up and going and give us full functionality. So that'll be here tomorrow. So for now, let's get this engine torn down. The carb looks pretty nasty. This is where the water was going in, but the choke surprisingly still works. The throttle, though, it is rusted in place. So if this engine actually was capable of running and you started it like that, it would just run at wide open throttle until the engine failed. And this is actually going to be hard to get off because when you pull this forward, the throttle needs to turn. Okay, there we go. Or the linkage won't come out. And there's what the throat looks like. So surprisingly, the throttle moves with very little effort to free it up. So let's turn this around. I'm going to set these valve pieces aside. And I guess that is one positive. Usually when there's moisture inside the engine, that moisture evaporates, goes up to the valves, and the valve area rusts out pretty bad. But in this case, it was rust-free. So there's a chance that the bottom end might look equally as good. So we'll get the tank off next. And I was going to say I'm kind of curious what it looks like in here given the rest of the machine. The tank, though, yeah, a little light surface rust on the bottom, but definitely still a good tank. Yeah, there is a very rusty screw in there that needs to come out. Not sure that's going to happen. Oh, yep, it's coming. So we'll get the throttle bracket off next. Just a bolt there and a bolt there. And then that'll give us access to the tank bolt on this side. And 2 on the other side. Get that rotator cap out of the way. Don't want to lose it because there is a very slight chance that this engine is still rebuildable, although I say that. And this valve should have fallen into the engine, and it hasn't. It actually doesn't move. How about the exhaust? Exhaust is also stuck. So, yeah, 2 bad signs are right there. So it doesn't look terrible. I mean, we do have stuck valves, although that one just moved a little. So it's not that stuck. You know, the head potentially could be cleaned up. And, you know, we can't see a whole lot, but obviously there's a bunch of junk right there that would prevent the piston from coming to the top. Now, the magnet, it is aligned with the coil we removed, so it's actually just coming up on top dead center. If that magnet was right here, we would be at top dead center. So we are very close. I think in this case, we want to rotate this counterclockwise to bring the piston down instead of trying to push through this stuff. But let's get some Scotch-Brite and some WD-40. We'll just try to clean up what we can get to, and then we'll try tapping this and see if we can get the piston to go down. And I'd say the engine was run at least once, given the carbon right there on the piston. It definitely moved. I've got to say, it does not look terrible. It certainly could have been a lot worse. I think with a honing, a new set of rings, I think this engine could run again. So we're going to have to shock this off the tapered shaft. There's nowhere to pull this flywheel from. So I'm going to rotate the magnet just so it's not in the way. We also have a critter nest behind the flywheel, so that's not going to help. But we want to get back there and just pry out and give it a few good strikes, and it should come right off. All right, so it is the moment of truth. If the bottom end is good, then I'd say there's a decent chance we can rebuild this. But it's not coming off without a fight. Let me try to tap that gently. Yeah, actually looks pretty good. Ball bearing's nice and smooth. The gears are not rusted. Camshaft looks to be in perfect condition. Compression release is fine. We have a bunch of garbage here on the bottom. That's easy enough to clean up. Lifters look good. At least the exhaust one. Let's take a look at the intake. Yeah. So the bottom end, from what I can see, looks good. So let's get the connecting rod cap bolts off. We'll get the crankshaft out, as well as the piston. Do have a little bit of rust here on the counterweight. But that'll clean off without issue, as long as the journal on the crankshaft is good. Wow, what did they torque that to? That should only be about 100 inch-pounds, maybe a little more. But, yeah, it's way more on this engine. Bearing feels good. Let's try to get the piston out. Yeah, piston really doesn't want to come out. The rings do appear to be stuck, which likely is not helping anything. All right, so the piston was a bit of a challenge to get out. Every single ring is stuck, which is no surprise given the water that was run through the system, at least from the top end past the rings. You know, the piston itself, though, doesn't look terrible. It's really, I think the rings are the big hang up on this. So a new set of rings, you know, likely we can use the piston. And the bottom end, from what I can tell, looks good. So I'm going to get the oil sensor out. Maybe we'll clean this up real quick. Or actually, before we clean it up, let's run the hone through the cylinder real quick and just see what that's going to look like. All right, I'm going to change it up. Yeah, I used the corded drill, which was probably a mistake. Seems like the slowest speed on that is way too fast. So normally I use a battery-operated drill with a transmission in it, so you can just set it kind of in the slower speed, but I let my son take that one to school, so instead we're going to try this one with the smaller hone. The other one we ran through there was, I think, too big for this size cylinder. So let's give this one a try. Yeah, I wouldn't say it looks great, but for the most part, that is just staining. You know, I cannot feel any of that, with the exception of maybe that spot right there. You know, it's kind of in the bottom of the travel of the piston and likely the bottom of the ring travel. So I don't think that's going to be a huge issue. And I think this engine would definitely build compression and run. I guess the question is, you know, would it burn oil? Not sure. So things actually don't look that bad in here. I mean, the camshaft we already looked at, it looks perfect. The crankshaft also looks good. You know, there is some minor surface rust on the outer journals, but that would clean up pretty easily. And the important journal for the connecting rod, it is absolutely perfect, as well as the journals here. So, you know, likely we can reuse the connecting rod and potentially the piston. You know, I guess it depends on the rings. They are all stuck, so at a minimum, those would have to be freed up. But ideally, we would replace the rings, possibly the piston. And, you know, I think this engine would run pretty well. So really the only question mark at this point is just this little spot right down there. And I would say the valves. You know, one of the valves did start to free up. I think it was the exhaust valve, but the intake was stuck. So I've had this soaking in some penetrating oil. So let's actually try to get the valves moving and see if the head is any good. Let's try the exhaust. That's the one that has the spring still on it. And actually that valve is moving just fine. So no issues there. The intake, that's the one we stole the spring on. And yeah, it's still not moving. So if I had to guess, I would say it's likely just the valve that's rusted to the seat, because all the water that got on the engine, it did come in through the intake and past that valve. So it's likely lightly rusted. So let's tap gently on that and see if we can break it free. Yeah, it's moving, but it does feel pretty tight. But it is coming out, actually. And I want to say it looks great in there. So I can't really see the seat because there's just a lot of rust and junk in the way. But from what I can see, you know, the seat doesn't look pitted. And the valve, yeah, also doesn't look too bad. You know, little surface rust right there in the face. So let's clean that with a bit of Scotch-Brite and probably do the same in here. See if it's going to be any good. Yeah, that valve cleaned up almost instantly. Still a little rust, so we'll keep going. But I think the valve's going to be usable. Yeah, that's a pretty big difference. Valve moves pretty well. You know, we do need to clean a little bit more. I'd say, yeah, just pulling the valve out, you can tell the guide has a little bit of junk in it, but that should be pretty easy to clean up. So exhaust valve, I think, is good. Let's check out the seat. Yeah, it's hard to tell. The seat down here, it does look a little pitted. And, you know, that would have been the low side for sure. So that's where the water was coming through. So I'm going to take a second, just lap this one valve in, see if that's going to clean up. Yeah, I think it looks good. I mean, certainly not new, but for an engine that had water run through it and locked up, you know, I think that seat will seal pretty well. The valve also lapped in real nice. And I've also cleaned out the valve guide. So the valve, it now goes in and opens and closes freely, you know, like it should. And it's also making a good seal. I cannot spin the valve. So the head, you know, definitely needs some more work, but I think it is usable. So I would say it is worth trying to put this engine back together. You know, there are obviously some issues with it. It's not going to run like new, but I think it is going to run and likely run pretty well. You know, based on the work we just did on the head, you know, I think that is going to be fine. The cylinder, even though it's discolored, you know, for the most part, none of that can be felt except this little spot kind of near the bottom of the ring travel. So I think the engine will run, it'll run well, and likely not smoke. But it's hard to know for sure until we get it back together. And it's not going to cost a whole lot to do it. You know, most of the parts are good. You know, we need a gasket kit for about $7 or $8 and a new set of rings, which likely isn't going to cost a whole lot of money. So, you know, I think it is worth the risk. So I'm going to get a set of rings ordered up as well. But for today, I'm going to clear the lift. You know, the main focus is the log splitter. We'll circle back on this in a week or two, get it put back together and fired up for the first time. So it is the next day, and we've got the valve that we need from Amazon. This one actually was a customer return. So I got it for a couple reasons. One, because it was a return, it was pretty cheap, only $68. And also because it was a customer return, this was essentially in the Amazon warehouse ready to be shipped. Whereas, any other valve I ordered was going to be 2 weeks to 2 months out. So it was kind of a no-brainer. And, although we could attach this one to the machine, we'd have to disconnect all the lines and make a mess doing it. There's really no need, at least as far as I can tell. The part we need is right here, and it appears to be identical to the one we pulled off to the log splitter. So I think the easier solution would be just to pull this auto stop off, get it mounted to the existing valve, and that should fix our problems. I guess the only thing I'm not liking too much is that on the other valve, I had to use vice grips to kind of remove this shaft. And I'm hoping to come up with something a little bit better this time because I don't want to damage the new part. So let's get this nut off. We'll get this outer housing off and then figure out where to go from there. So I'm thinking, or at least hoping, that this one's going to come apart easier since it's not rusted. Although that might be wishful thinking. Might need to get the vice grips on there like the last one, because that feels like it's going to strip out. Yeah, this one looks exactly the same except no corrosion. So that just sprung back, so we know we got a good spring in there. And that actually just released the balls, which we just dropped one. So I was going to say leave this in place, but we do need to pull this out. Definitely coming apart a lot easier. And it looks a lot better. So we've got one of the smaller balls too. There should be 2 left in there. 1 fell on the floor. We better just get the rest of them out now before we lose them. And let me see if I can find anything that'll fit in there. I'd rather twist it out how it was meant to be rather than vice grips, but yeah, we'll do what we need to. So not the right tool, but it does fit in the slots. And I obviously haven't used it in a while, so I don't think we're going to hurt anything. So let me get a socket on the other end. We'll try to twist this out. Now, just bending the drill bit. So I think vice grips are the only way to go here. This one's definitely putting up a fight. It's been a few times I thought I had it. It was very tight on there, so there's definitely some thread sealant, I would say, like on the other one. So these, although they look identical, there is one pretty big difference, and that is the thread, unfortunately, that screws into the valve body. The new one, it is a wider diameter than the one that's on the log splitter right now. So although this will function the same, we can't actually thread it in, and because of that, we can't just swap the part that we need. We actually need to pull the old valve in its entirety off the machine and install the new. So I'm going to pause it, take a second, get the new valve back together, and then we'll get it installed on the machine. So we're back together. I did add some thread sealant back to those threads, so hopefully we don't have a leak. I do want to test it real quick though, as far as the function of the detent. Right now it is in the retract position. The detent is holding it there. And if I back off the spring tension, we should hit a point where the lever releases and returns to neutral, which is right there. So like that, there's not enough pressure at all to hold the valve in the retract position. So I gave it a half a turn. It's now holding. We're going to have to fine tune this when it's on the machine, but where it is right now is kind of the minimum setting. So although we got this end back together, I wouldn't say we're out of the woods yet. I mean, this is a returned part, and also the orientation for the lever is incorrect. The valve has to be mounted to the cylinder in this orientation, and the lever needs to face up. So I believe if we crack those screws free, that we can likely rotate this housing 180 degrees, putting the lever in the correct position. Perfect. All right, so we need to get these lines disconnected first. This is the return to the tank, and the high pressure side comes in on the bottom. Now, the new valve, it's the opposite. The high pressure comes in on the top, which isn't a big deal. These lines are long enough to do that. So I believe we can get the low pressure side off the fitting. We'll get the fitting removed and then do the same on the high pressure side. And then we can move on to the two lines going to the cylinder. This line is cracking right here, so I don't think there's any point in trying to be nice when taking it off. We're going to have to cut it back before reinstalling it. And that one could be a little interesting because we don't really have a straight shot on it. I'm also hoping this is not a compression fitting, so you're not supposed to reuse those. Okay, we're spinning. And actually, this brings up a good point. The only reason I can do this right now is because we don't have the auto stop valve on. And of course, the new valve does. So we might need to get in here with like a crow's foot wrench or something that can work a little better in tight spaces. It's definitely hard to work on hydraulics without making a complete mess. So I'm just going to clean off this old Teflon tape. Technically, regular Teflon isn't really rated for oil. So you want to use like the yellow Teflon. And I also have some thread sealant, which is oil rated. So I'm probably going to go with that instead of using Teflon or the appropriate yellow tape. Yeah, it's not supposed to happen. There's a cap in there we need to pull out before we can get the fitting in. All right, so we get this fitting in next. The threads were cleaned, degreased, and I took a little bit of Scotch-Brite to that seal right there. It has a pretty good chance of forming a seal a second time. Okay, good. We still make it to the pump. And no thread sealant on this fitting. So I've trimmed this return line by about a foot. So we'll get it the rest of the way back on, clamp it down, and I think we'll be ready to give this thing a try. All right, so place your bets. Did I plumb this right? Is this cheap Amazon part going to work? And how many leaks are we going to have? You know, I think it will work. I think I plumbed it right, but I'm fairly certain we're going to have at least one leak. So let's get the engine started and find out. Well, I was about to declare victory. You know, the valve looks nice and dry, but then I looked down here, and there is a small puddle forming right about there below this fitting. So I'm going to snug that up. You know, we'll get the engine restarted and check it again. Well, the fitting didn't seem that loose. You know, tightening it, I got just a tiny bit of movement out of it, but that seemed to do it. You know, there is no active drip anymore. The fitting looks nice and dry. So at this point, you know, I think the machine is ready, or at least ready enough to get it outside and put it to the test. So let's do that. We'll split some wood and see how it does. And just for the record, I know someone's going to ask, I did tighten the lock nut down, install the cap, and I had to top off the tank. We were actually a little bit low after swapping out the valve, and I was getting ready to add this plate back, But I was kind of debating it because it's not in great shape, not very legible. And then I went to actually install it and found that these were not threaded. So, we could add threads to it, but quite honestly, given the condition of that label, I don't think it's really adding a whole lot, and pretty intuitive as far as how to operate it. So I'm going to leave the data plate off. All right, so we'll put this machine through its paces. And unfortunately, all the wood I have, at least the good wood, is already split. But I don't have any kindling, so I'm going to break this down even more. And we have this big log right here, which is definitely not very usable, at least for burning, but still feels pretty solid. So we'll split that as well, just to put this machine through its paces and make sure we're good to go. All right, guys, and I think that is pretty much it. For an 8-year-old machine, this had a surprising amount of serious problems. Luckily we had an engine that we went through previously, and it was a direct replacement for what was on there. And the valve, definitely affordable and seems to do the job just fine. So, I would say we're at 100%. No issues at all getting these logs split. Really, the only two things I might tweak are the valve as far as the auto neutral pressure. It was popping out sometimes prematurely. And I think that was just due to some debris in the track. But another quarter turn on that spring likely will get the issue fixed. And we're also losing hydraulic oil from the vent on the cap. And that's largely due to the fact that we're a little bit unlevel. This side is low, and because of that, the sight glass now says we're overfilled, and likely the oil is just kind of working its way out. It's most of the way there already. So, I might take a little oil out, otherwise it will self-correct. And even better is just to run this level or in such a way that this is the high point instead of the low point. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.